are some of the earliest examples of theoretical criticism.
Shall we have a look at more recent examples of literary theory?
Yes,
Let's look at
especially
the next slide.
because literary theory has been an important branch of thought right from Aristotle's time right up to ours. Rennie Welleck and Austin Warren's Theory of Literature and Jonathan Culler's Literary Theory, a very short introduction, are recent examples of theoretical criticism. And the picture you see is of Jonathan Culler.
Uh, Other very pertinent examples of recent theoretical studies of literature would include Catherine Bell's Critical Practice and slightly dated but equally interesting Northrop Frye's Anatomy of Criticism in probably 1949,
Yeah,
probably the same year as René Welleck and Austin Warren's
yeah.
book was published.
These are texts that you might be studying either in the third year of BA or perhaps in MA. But it is useful, however, to know that such texts exist and to uh, recognize that it is not enough to read a poem, but you must also understand what that poem means and how to discuss that poem.
Exactly. So again, we come to the idea of literature as a form of language, which we use to discuss something which is already linguistic, like work of art in which is called literature. So some people use the term meta language to describe criticism.
Yeah. Meta means over. Language, all of you know. So, meta language means it is a language about language. So, literary criticism can be, or literary theory can be thought of as a language about language.
So, interestingly, while theoretical criticism looks at literary texts in a very broad perspective, which are historical, social, cultural, philosophical, practical criticism looks at the individual and particular aspects of the text. So, let's have a closer look at what do we understand by the term practical criticism. Let's look at the next slide.
The image you see on your screen is the one of the most important works of practical criticism, and I.A. Richards is the critic who is very closely associated with this method of criticism. Practical criticism involves analysis, interpretation, and evaluation of particular literary texts rather than discussion of literature in general.
I think that is a very important term in general, because in theoretical criticism we are looking at literary texts from a very broad perspective. In practical criticism we are attending to very specific and particular qualities and elements of the text that we are confronted with. For example, when you are analyzing a poem or a novel, you are dissecting it, you're interpreting it, you're explaining it, at the same time you're evaluating it, you are practicing what is known as practical criticism.
The study of specific texts is very important to the subject of English literature. Most of what we do in our undergraduate courses focuses on the study of particular texts. So much of what students of undergraduate classes do is practical criticism. What is done in our classrooms is practical criticism. But when we study a poem or a play or a novel, we find that we just looking at the words on the page is not sufficient. We also need to understand the context, that is, when the poem was written and how it was written.
Right. And also why it was written, probably. When we are trying to place it in a very broader cultural context, we are trying to understand the text in a very broader context when we are using what is the theoretical approach to
To give an
criticism.
example, one of the texts that we study is Shakespeare's Macbeth. I'm sure some of you would have seen the film Makbul, and Makbul is supposed to be based on Shakespeare's Macbeth. Now, in the why did Shakespeare write Macbeth when he did? After all, it's about what is Macbeth about? It's about a king. It's about the murder of a king. And it is about how what happens when you try to become a king by wrongful means. Now, the reason why kingship was so important in Shakespeare's time was because monarchy was the burning issue of that time. Similarly, when we look at Pannalal Patel's Bhavni Bhavai, you find that he writes about hunger, right?
Yeah.
He writes about hunger and the plight of common people because that is the burning issue of his time. So you cannot understand the text only by reading the text. We all need to understand history a little bit in order to understand the meanings of that text.
I fully agree with you, Deepta. And at the same time, let me point out that practical criticism is, as Deepta said, very closely tied up with classroom practice, and that's why earliest examples of practical criticism were tied to the idea of classroom teaching or what is called pedagogy. If you look at the examples of practical criticism in the next slide, you will see that some of them are purely for classroom purposes, like Understanding Poetry by Cleant Brooks and Robert Penn Warren is an excellent example where the critics show how to analyze, discuss, evaluate those poems or the texts.
Particularly for the classroom.
Classroom.
And though it was published in 1938, it still continues to be in wide use even till today. This shows that practical criticism is an essential part of English literature in India today as well.
Right. So, till now, we have seen some of the very basic and fundamental ideas that a student of literature ought to know. And those ideas, let me recapitulate very quickly. The first is the distinction between the two ways of using the term literature, which helped us to define something like literature. The definitions are, of course, very difficult, but for our purpose, a working definition of literature is what we arrived at when we said that literature without the use of definite article which indicates text having significant cultural value, artistic value, are called can be classified as literature. The second thing that we thought about was the term English literature, and we saw that it's not a simple term at all, and it has got a whole variety of meanings, and the whole term English literature includes various kinds of texts, the texts from England, those texts written in English, those texts written by people who come from England, and the literary texts which are translated from other languages into English language. Then we went over to the whole idea of literary studies, wherein we looked at the three aspects of literary studies. One is theoretical literary theory, the other was literary criticism, and the third, the very important category, is that of literary history, and that is what we are going to look at a bit closely now. Now let's look at the term literary history. So we'll look at it in our next slide. What is literary history?
Literary history implies history of a particular literature, that is, history of Gujarati literature or history of English literature. It is concerned with changes in literary norms, periodization, dominant trends, important authors, texts of various periods and tradition.
So when we study literature and when we study English literature, as we move ahead, then we are confronted with various periods and eras in which literature was produced, and we read those literary texts as representing those periods and eras. So, some of very common periods in English literature are as follows. So, we'll just put it up for you. You can take them down if you want. Let's have a look at the common periods of English literature.
Slow down. Shakespeare, for example, wrote in the Elizabethan age. The Commonwealth period was the period where Milton flourished. So you can see each of these ages, Renaissance, Elizabethan, Jacobean, Caroline, and Commonwealth, had their own important writers and different genres. For example, in the Elizabethan period, drama was more popular. In the Commonwealth period, drama was banned and the focus was on prose and on poetry. In the next century, you have the Restoration period, which comes towards the end of the 17th century, the Neoclassical period, the Augustan age, where important writers like Swift and Pope wrote, the age of sensibility, where people started focusing on emotion, and the Romantic period with the famous Wordsworth, Coleridge, Keats, and Shelley, with the special focus on poetry. And finally, we have the Victorian period of the 19th century, the Edwardian period of the early 20th century, the Georgian period, and finally, from 1914, the beginning of the First World War, we have the modern period, a period which has decisively changed literature in a way that has affected drama, poetry, and prose in a way which has never been seen before. And today we have postmodernism as well.
So you can see that a student of literature has to know what is literary history. Student of literature is supposed to know the definitions of the term literature. The student of English literature ought to know what is English literature, and these are the things that we looked at in a very basic and simple way. Another very important idea that is related to the idea of literary history is the idea of canon. What do you think, Dipta, about the term canon? Is it the same canon that you find on the forts?
Not actually. Canon really is a very simple thing. It just means a list. It's just a list of books. But it's a very special kind of list, like a merit list. When colleges open and you're anxiously looking at your name, is my name on the merit list? In the same way, canon is just a list of very special literary books which is to be found in English literature. Sachin, I was wondering if we had any questions from students who have been listening to us so far, and if we can take some questions if there are any.
Yeah, if students have questions, they can call us here. The numbers are given to the colleges. This was a very fruitful session. Both the eminent faculties have discussed the very basic concept, what is literature, the very basic question that every student faces when he enters colleges as a student of literature. And I am very glad that both of them have clarified the issues minutely in detail, giving very interesting examples and making things lucid for the students. And I hope all of them must have enjoyed. Dr. Sachin, Uh, we often hear about literature of power and literature of knowledge. That is how we usually divide literature. So, can we say something about that to our students?
Interestingly, the distinction between literature of power and literature of knowledge was made by De Quincey
Yeah.
in 19th century, and probably what he was trying to do is to have his own list of his authors
Yeah.
in the merit list.
His
Yeah.
own
An
canon.
attempt at
Canon.
canonization. Yeah.
Yeah.
An attempt.
Yeah.
But in a general way, we can say that the literature that gives information, that is what he wanted to suggest. That literature that gives information, that is the word literature used in a very general sense. For instance, a telephone directory, and we say I have all the literature about, say, inflation, and there we use the word literature in a very general way.
We use
Telephone
it with
directory or
the,
railway
definite
timetable,
article.
yeah,
Use
that
it
is
with
the
a
literature.
definite article.
And when we say literature, that means literature of power, that is creative literature.
Right.
That is what probably the distinction suggested. And as you rightly said, De Quincey was attempting a sort of canonization. He was
Right.
giving, he was making a list of his own writers who have merit. So that is how I think literature can be best understood. Our students will now come in close contact with works of literature. They will read them, they will form their own opinion, and that is when I think the literary study begins. The student starts forming their own opinion about a poem. When he says that I like this poem, then the critic in him begins to react and starts analyzing, appreciating, evaluating the text that he has with him. We have some textbooks. Shall we show them
Yeah,
to
these
our
are very
students?
useful books
Yeah.
for literary studies for beginners. The first is Glossary of Literary Terms by M.H. Abrams. Then you can have a